Hi there, welcome to QA Box. Let's test. If you have not already subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. So, alright, in this video, we are going to talk about some of the web concepts like HTTP, API, and REST APIs. Alright, so before we dive into the details, let's open our web browser and check a couple of things. So, this is a web browser, and what I've done is I have picked this particular URL which is going to display us the list of Bengali tigers. Okay, so before I hit this request, what I want to do is I want to open the developers toolbar and navigate to networks tab. Okay, so what you are seeing here are basically the resources. All right, and we'll talk about resources. But some of these are like JavaScript files, your CSS files, the images, the media that you are seeing in here, different font styles that are being required on this web page, and the document, basically the HTML page, and so on. All right. So when I use this URL, which is HTTPS, right, and then this, and then this, right? So we'll understand all these different components of the URL as well in this video. But let me first click on this reload and see what all things are being downloaded. So these are all the network requests made to fetch a specific resource. All right. So if I can filter out based on images, so you could see that these are all the images that are being downloaded. Of course, they are not being displayed here, but these are essentially all the network requests that we have made. So if we can click on the header section, so you could see that there is a general header section, there's a response header section, there's a request header section, and also query string parameters. So we are going to understand all of these things in this tutorial. All right. And also, like the plain uh, XHR requests, fetch requests. So what are these? So we'll understand these as well. So here also you could see that what is this request payload, right? Then you have, I mean, these are the pretty much the same, right? General, response header, and request headers. Okay. So now let's move to our slide. All right, and understand what are these web resources. So what is a web resource? A resource can be anything that has the identity. So in that particular case which I was showing on the browser, right, where we're downloading the collection of tigers, so all those files, right, all those XHR requests, means those services, all those images, these are all called as web objects, right? They, and in response, you could get one resource or you could get a collection of resources, and in that particular case we were getting the collection of tiger images, right? So then what is a resource? A resource could be a normal text file. All right, it could be an audio file, it could be a video file, it could be an image file, it could be the HTML document, it could be a service. And a service example could be what's the today's weather for New Delhi. All right, so and then the database as well, because when you work with web application, right, you fetch data from the database and display it on the UI of the web application. All right, so that is also a resource. So if we understand now what is a resource, then what is client server architecture basically? How can we fetch a resource residing there on the other machine, right? These two machines are separated, but then we know that with the help of internet, these machines are connected. So what happens is we have a client, we have a server, right? Server has got these resources. So if a client wants to access one of the resource, client has to send a request to the server for the specific resource, and of course there is a protocol in between. If there are certain conditions that need to be fulfilled before server can share that resource, right, of course those criteria should be met. Imagine there are no criteria, everything, all these resources are public, so you send a request, all right, to the server gives the response back, and the resource is there in the response. Okay, So just like we use our web browser, right, with the help of user agent, we sent our request to the server, and server downloaded all those images, pages for us. Okay, those fonts, those CSS and everything. So you have the clients, right? And on clients, we have the user agents which do the job on behalf of these clients, right? And send the request which follows the HTTP protocol, and we'll talk about that in a while. So we send HTTP request to the server. Server looks out for a particular resource, which again is mentioned in the request only, right? If server finds that resource, server sends back the response and the resource. Okay. If the resource is not available, server says that resource not found, right? Or 404 status code, if you might have seen that earlier. Okay. So that's about client server architecture. Now we talked about HTTP. Okay. So what is HTTP? HTTP is an acronym for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. This is a protocol which allows the fetching of resources such as HTML documents, images, videos, scripts, and more. And we saw that practically, right? So client and server communicate by exchanging individual messages. The messages sent by the client, usually a web browser, are called as requests, and the messages sent by the server as an answer are called as responses. And hence, you see a point, third point, which is HTTP request response cycle. So it's a cycle, right? Client sends the request, server processes it and sends the response back. So it's a cycle, all right? So it is used to establish communication between web server and client. We have seen that, right? It's a stateless protocol. What does that mean, right? So a request is like just like a transaction. So the request does not know anything about the previous request, and therefore it is the responsibility of the client to send all the required information in the request every time. Okay, and the default port for HTTP is 80. So therefore, when you make any such request, right, you don't provide that 80 because by default it is 80. However, if your application is running on any other protocol, right, any other port, sorry, so then you have to provide the port information as well. Okay, there is a more secured version of HTTP which is called as HTTPS, and that is Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. So whatever data we send using this protocol is encrypted using SSL and TLS. These are another technologies. So now how can we achieve that? We have to install the certificate on the web host. So web host is nothing. It's a web server which has got access to all the resources that we want. And the default port for HTTPS is 443, right? So if I open this and come here, we see HTTPS, and this is a secured site. This is a sign, okay, for secured websites. All right. So we have talked about client server, we have talked about HTTP and HTTPS. Now, what are the different methods? Now, see, you require resources for something, right? Either you want to access those resources or you want to manipulate those resources, right? So, how is that possible? So, that is possible by these HTTP methods. Now, post is what? It creates a resource. You must have worked on applications, where you submit a form. So you fill in all the values in those respective fields, and then there's one button right through which you submit a form. So what essentially you're doing is you're creating a new resource, all right? Or you might be updating an existing resource. Okay, so the method that those are which are used behind the scene are these. And if we again go back to that example, and if I check this out, and in the get, you see the request method is post in this particular case. All right. So whenever you make a request for a resource, right, so you must be providing one of these values. One of these methods has to be there. So when you create a resource, right, you use the method post. And when you post, you also provide the request payload, means the request body, because you have to create a resource, so you have to provide the data, all right, to create that resource. So second method is your get is to read a resource, all right. So the resource already exists on the server side, now you want to read that. So for that you have to use the http verb or http method as get. What is put stands for either you update an existing resource or you replace an existing resource. All right. uh, Here also you need to, because you have to manipulate the existing data, so you have to provide the complete object in the request payload. What is patch? So instead of providing the complete object, let's say you just want to update two properties, right? So then you can make use of this particular http method patch, and this way you don't need to provide the complete object. In case of put, you have to provide the complete object even if you are updating only one or two values. Delete, if you want to delete a resource, then you use this verb. So this is about http methods. All right. Now imagine you are working on an application which interacts with the database. All right. So how can we translate these methods into SQL statements? Is there a relation? Yes, there is a relation. So as you could see, first of all, post is to create, and read, update, delete. So this forms the CRUD operations. Okay. So now about SQL, right? So what are the respective methods into SQL? So for post, right, which is create, you have the insert queries, right? So for get, you have the select. For put and patch, you have update. And for delete, you definitely have delete. So that's the mapping of these methods. So whenever you send those requests, just, you know, feel like, you are doing these operations, right? Now, it's an interesting thing now. So what is URI? URI stands for Uniform Resource Identifier. All right, so now we know what a resource is, all right, and we have to identify that resource to be able to work on that. How can we identify that? Again, with the help of URLs, right? So in this particular case, what did we do? So we enter this URL in our browser, right? And our user agent then sent the request on our behalf, and we got our resource back. All right. So uniform resource identifier. So a resource can be identified by its name or by its address. In the particular example, if you could see, name could be a JSON, right? And address could be the address. So these are the two ways you can identify an object. All right. Now let's understand the different components involved into a URI. Let's call it URI at this point. So URI consists of following parts. So if you could see that HTTP, it could also be HTTPS, right? We talked about it. That is called as a scheme, right? That's a protocol. Then the next one is your authority. We also call that as, so this particular domain is your authority. We also call it domain. We also called it host, right? So then port, we talked about it. If it's running on the default port for HTTP, it's 80. For HTTPS, it's 443. Then we don't need to provide that. However, if it is running on a different port, then we also have to provide the port information in the URL. Then the next is, so this basically defines, the web server on which the resources are there. But then what is path to resource? It's like you have your C drive, right? And then inside that you have created, let's say, a movie folder, and inside that, there's a movie called as Titanic, right? So there's a path to that resource, all right? and the resource in this particular example is your movie Titanic, right? So path to resource is basically again on that particular server where that resource is placed. So we have to provide the path of the resource, and then what is this question mark? All right, so imagine your resource is basically a collection. All right, so for example, animals, right? So in animals collection, there could be more than one animal, right? And now you want to identify only, let's say, animal with the name tiger. Okay, so what are you going to do? You are going to filter out your results. All right, so how can you filter out your results? You can filter out your results using query parameters. Okay, and then at the end we have fragment. So you have the hashtag, and then you have the fragment. So what is fragment? Fragment refers to the partial aspect of a resource. So in your when you load this page with the fragment, your page would be scrolled down automatically to that particular segment on your page or fragment on your page, because there is an embedded fragment tag. With the help of that tag, when you load this URL, your page will scroll down directly to that subsection on that page. All right, so that's called as your fragment. So these are different components there in a URI. All right, so what is URL? So URL stands for Uniform Resource Locator, and you might have been using this term a lot. And a resource can be identified by its address. So when you identify a resource by an address, it is called as URL. And when you identify the resource with a name, then it is called as URN. So basically, URI is a superset, URN and URL are subsets. So every URN and URL are definitely URIs. Okay. All right, so then the next thing is headers, right? When we sent the request, we saw there was some headers like general, request, response, right? So what is basically an header? So HTTP headers let the client and server pass additional information with an HTTP request or response. An HTTP header consists of key and value separated by colon. Okay, so it's something like, it's a meta data about your request and response. So header can broadly be categorized into these four categories based on the context. So some are general headers. General headers are applied to both request and response. However, they have no relation to the body, which was payload as well, right? We saw that request payload. So these are general headers. Request headers contain more information about the resource to be fetched or about the client requesting the resource. All right. Response header hold additional information about the response, like its location, or about the server which is providing that response. Entity header contain information about the body of the resource, like its content length or MIME type. All right. Some of the examples are of HTTP header: general, cache control, connection, date. For request, we have authorization, host, user agent, what kind of response we are expecting, and the content length. So when we are providing, uh, the file, or when we are loading the file, right, to the server, then we have to provide the boundary value of that file. Okay. Response, like on which server your particular resource is positioned, right? What is the keep alive duration, last modified, when is the resource last modified, set cookies. Entity, like, content type. So when the server sends a response back, what is the content type? Is it JSON, it is XML, it is, HTML, what is that? And content encoding. All right, so let's check that in here, and we go to the headers, and you could see that request URL, request method, status code, remote address, and referral policies. These are all general headers. Response headers, like accept ranges, cache control, connections, content length, content type, all right, date, e-tag, when it is going to expire, cookie information, and all that, right? There are a lot. Request headers, cookie, content type, content length, connection, the host, the origin, the referrer, the user agent, which we talked about, okay, and the viewport information, which is like, where I'm viewing that. All right. And then request payload is your body. Okay. So this is about headers. It is very important that we have to understand these headers, because if you don't provide the required headers while sending the request, right, it may not work. Okay, so you have to provide at least the mandatory headers while making an HTTP request. When you work on browsers, you don't need to worry about it. But when you start working on APIs, which we'll talk about, then you have to provide all that information by yourself. Okay. So therefore, it is important we understand the headers concept. Now, what's next? So HTTP response status code. All right. So let's go to our website again and check that out. So do we see a response in here? So status code 200. Okay, so that's the response. All right. So what is that? So response status, HTTP response status code indicates us whether a specific HTTP request has been successfully completed or not. So these are broadly again categorized into 5 classes. So 100 to 199 belongs to the informational response space. Success responses are from 200 to 299, and some of the important ones are listed on the right hand side. 200 is for okay. 201 is basically when you create a new record, or post a new record and it is successfully created, then you get this 201 created. Then you have got the redirects, right? So 304 not modified, or basically you cached your last response and now you are fetching it from your last response only, right? That's redirect. Client side error. So while sending that request, maybe we have not provided the request payload in the right order. Maybe we have not provided all the required fields. Maybe we have not passed in the authorization information. Maybe we are requesting for a resource which does not exist. So you have all these different status codes for that. So for bad request means data not provided in the correct format. You're going to see this when you don't provide the authorization information again in the header. That's one of the request header. Then you get 401 unauthorized. If you asking for a resource which does not exist on the server, you're going to get this 404 back. Server errors 500 to 599 are these internal server error. When something breaks on the server side, then you get this, which is very bad, and we have to handle all such exceptions. Now, what is API? So API is the acronym for Application Programming Interface, which is a software intermediary that allows two applications to talk to each other. Okay, so API is just like a messenger which takes a request from one client and sends it to the server, right? And informs what is to be done, and then returns the response back to the calling client. All right. It also provides the language and contract for how one piece of software has to interact with another. All right. So it's a set of routines, protocols, and tools for building software applications. An API specifies software components, how software components should interact. In general term, it is a set of clearly defined methods of communication between various software components. All right. So in short, it is an application programming interface. So you do not have the UI, and now you have to work with the programming interface. And basically in APIs, a program is communicating with another program and saying, hey, I want data, the specific data in the specific format, right? So APIs are everywhere. They are in your computer, they are in your operating system, they are in your mobile phones, right? And the various features that they provide are access data. We know that at least, right? But their usage is beyond that. So APIs hide the complexity when two services have to communicate with each other. It also provides you extended features and functionalities and offers you the security as well, right? So these are some of the features provided by APIs. It's like, when two people have to communicate with each other, they should be using the same language, right? And they should be following certain, you know uh, grammar rules so that they can communicate with each other. Let's understand it by an analogy, which is like, you go to a restaurant, right, as a customer, and you want to have some meals. All right, so you look at the menu, and there's a kitchen, right? So on the right hand side, so this is your kitchen, and you are the customer, right? So you see what is available in the kitchen, and the waiter comes in and takes your order, so takes your request, right? Inform the kitchen that this is what you want. Kitchen processes that and gives it to the waiter. Waiter serves you your meal. All right, so what is the waiter in this case? Waiter is nothing. Waiter is an API. All right, and if we translate all that into our web technologies, so these requests are HTTP requests, right? What protocol we are using? We are using HTTP protocol. All right, and our waiter understands what we require, because it may also happen that we know English, but the person in the kitchen may not. So API under the waiter understands both of us, so he or she is able to translate our request properly to the chef in the kitchen. That's the job of APIs. Okay, now what is REST then? Okay, so REST is an acronym for representational state transfer. It is an architecture style for distributed hypermedia systems. Like any other architecture style, REST also does have its own 6 guiding constraints, which must be satisfied if an interface needs to be referred as RESTful. These principles are basically client server. We talked about client server. Stateless, again, we talked about it. So each request, again, I'm repeating that each request from client to server must contain all the information necessary to understand the request and cannot take advantage of any stored context on the server. Session state is therefore kept entirely on the client. All right, and cacheable. So cache constraint requires the data within the response to a request be implicitly or explicitly labeled as cacheable or non-cacheable. If a response is cacheable, then a client cache is given the right to reuse the response data for later equivalent requests. Other three are uniform interface, layered system, and code on demand. Okay. Now, REST treats every server object as a resource. Any information that can be named can be a resource, right? A collection, a document or image, a temporal service, a collection of other resources, and so on. REST uses a resource identifier to identify the particular resource involved in an interaction between components. Right? And we have talked about that. Okay. So now, what are the different methods? Again, the methods are from the HTTP. Right? These methods are put, post, patch, get, and delete. All right. So let's understand representational state transfer in little more detail. So what is representational, what is state, and what is transfer? So let's imagine there is a table employee, all right, and currently the employee is, let's say, an IT analyst, okay, and let's say after a month he or she is being promoted to a senior IT analyst role, all right. So now when you, let's say, check the employee status today, what you will see in your response is IT analyst. But when you send the request after a month, all right, what you will see is software senior IT analyst. All right. So that is the state. All right. So current state is IT analyst. After a month, it would be senior IT analyst. That's a state. All right. So in the response, we are transferring the state which is being represented. All right. So that's called as representational state transfer. So we are not sending the actual resource, we are sending a copy of it. So therefore, it is representational of what? Of state which we are transferring in the response. And hence, representational state transfer. All right. At times people are confused about that. Okay, we understand URI, we understand URL, then what is this API endpoint? So simply putting it, an endpoint is one end of the communication channel. When an API interacts with another system, the touch point of this communication are considered as endpoints. For APIs, an endpoint can include a URL of a server or service. Each endpoint is the location from which API can access the resources they need to carry out their function. APIs work using request and response chain, right? We just like HTTP protocol. So when an API requests information from a web application or web server, it will receive a response. All right. The place that API sends request and where the resource lives is called as an endpoint. Simple, right? So it's just like your URL. Now, a live example, real-time example of REST API would be, you know, so whenever you have to plan your vacations, you have to book your flights, you have to book your hotels, right? And there are so many flight carriers, there are so many hotels. So you don't visit each and every website. So what you do is you prefer to go to a travel service website, and that website you just provide your dates and the destination where you want to go and submit your request. Internally, your website is making API call to all those hotels and all those flight carriers, right? And give you the response back on just one page. Convenient, isn't it? So this is possible because of these REST APIs. So those hotels, those uh, flight companies, they have provided APIs which your travel service website can make use of and provide you the data in the form of response. Okay, so when two systems are communicating with each other, it is important that which data exchange format to be picked, and it should be one which can be easily read by both the parties. So there are two options, and in fact these days we work with JSON and not XML because it's lighter, easy to manage, easy to read. So JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and if you could see that on the right hand side, this is very much like your JavaScript object. You have the keys and you have the values. Okay, so this is your JSON object notation, and XML stands for Extensible Markup Language. And here you could see that, I mean, this is the same representation, but in the form of same representation of this cow object, but now in the form of XML. So you see that these are the different attributes, and it is heavier than your JSON. Okay, so I think so. How does we get the response back in the format of JSON and XML? So this is a serialized response. So what do I mean by that? So what happens is the data is there in your database, right? Let's imagine we are working on SQL Server. So you have a table for animals in there, all right? And what you see in here is a row in the table, all right? So now that value is read from the database and loaded into our REST API, all right? And to be specific, in the model that we have created, model is nothing, it's a class. So it's a data structure which represents the table schema, all right? And now the thing is, we have read the data from the database into the model, but when we have to display that data in the response to the user, we are going to transform that either into JSON or XML. That's called as serialization. Okay, same way, when we send the data in our post request, what we essentially do is we create, let's say, the request payload in the format of JSON, and we convert that first into the model class object, and that is called as deserialization. And then with the help of either drivers or ORM softwares, we post that object directly into the database, which then creates a new resource. So that's how we serialize and deserialize our data. We have covered all the topics, and let's now use that information in Postman and set up a REST request. So what I've done is I've created a REST API application. Yeah, so we are here. So I've set my authorization, which is and this is a feature of Postman. It's being translated here into a header, which is the request header. We talked about it, right? So what I've done is, this is my protocol, right? This particular application is running on this particular domain, which is my local machine. So, and then it is running on this particular port. This is the path to animals resource, all right? And this is the ID of that particular resource. So in animals, if I show you animals, so you see that it returns us a list of a collection of animals. Okay, so you see that it is returning us a collection of animals, and this is the response body. And you see no cookies in here, headers. So these are server headers, server side headers. So it is telling me, okay, this is your server and is powered by ASP.NET, and this is the date, right, content length and content type. Then this is the status we talked about, right? So 200, okay. And these are your request headers, okay. And we typically don't send body into our get request. I'll show you one post request as well. And this is how we kind of send our JSON body. And patch is slightly different because we have to specify a body in a different format. So we have to provide op operation, which is replace in this particular case, and this is the property that I want to update, and this is a new value that I want to set, right? So this is how you can work on. Once you have all this information, you got to set all these, right, and you will get your response back. Okay, so this was about HTTP, APIs, and REST APIs. Now what after this? So now as a tester, you if you understand all these concepts, right, what I've done is, so go to my channel, QA box, let's test, and take it to the next level. So what I've done is I've created two playlists. So in the first one, you could see that this is more technical video here, and I have explained how an REST API is developed. Again, you don't need to learn, and again you don't need to learn basically how to develop APIs. What I've done here in this video is touched upon those different items or different modules that developers develop, right, while building those REST APIs. And as a tester, right, you have to, because there is no UI, right, so you have no friend, like you can learn it by looking at it, by working on it. So here you have to build up some basic concepts, and then it becomes your friend, and serve you great in the long run. So do one thing, go through this video as well couple of times to get hold of what all things developers develop, so that you test all of those things, because there is no UI. Only your information, your knowledge about the terms and technologies will help you in building right set of test cases and generating you know uh, coverage, more coverage for your APIs. All right. Now, once this is also done, then there are 31 videos created into learn API testing using Postman. Go through these as well. So by end of these 4 videos, you will be able to say that yes, I can do API automation testing. All right. Thank you so much. Hope you liked it. Bye bye. And of course, if you have not subscribed to my channel, please do subscribe. Thank you so much. Bye.